Good evening, everybody. My name is Jagat Vikramasekara. I warmly welcome you all to today's presentation on economic crisis in Sri Lanka, roots, current status, and way forward. Let me start with a small story. Last time when I parked my vehicle at a petrol shed to fuel my vehicle, it was the usual day for me. I asked him to fill the tank. Halfway through, I asked how much would be the total by now. He checked the meter. Obviously, the whole amount was far beyond what I expected. Full tank of few months back. So I was just thinking, should I argue with this person who is filling the fuel? So whom to blame? What's the real scenario? What's the problem behind that? That's what I was thinking on the way back. I hope everyone can hear me. Can you hear me? Can somebody reply me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. And at the same time, at the supermarket, at the checkout counter, when you see the total summation of your bill, it's useless that you are arguing with the checkout girl. When you are paying your electricity bill, your water bill, situation will not be the same very pretty soon. So that is the situation we are facing right now. As building services engineers, we always deal with biggest or big construction project. There are a lot of construction going on right now in the country. We see what is happening in the construction industry right now. To be honest, personally, I know how many projects has been cancelled right now. How many projects have taken to a different phase. How many workers, how many engineers are in a critical situation right now in terms of their job security. Certain companies are facing even severe financial issues and they are not in a position to pay their salaries. So we feel the current situation right now. What should we do? This is the biggest question. Should we keep on criticizing? Should we keep on continuing what we have been doing? As engineers, before we do any course of action, we should know the depth and the dimension of the problem. Then only we can comment. Then only we can contribute. This is the idea behind this particular session today. Building Services Engineering Sectional Committee has been there number of years under the umbrella of Institution of Engineers Sri Lanka, serving and catering various issues in the country. Mostly we focus on building services engineering sector, but right now we can't simply rely on our technical aspects because the problem is far bigger than what we expect. Various people are telling so many stories. Some said that we have applied the brake, situation would be okay. But some are telling, no, the worst is just started. Once you hear this, all the stories, once you hear this, all the comments, once you hear this situation reports on daily basis, people are shouting, they're asking so many things, their demands have gone up and down. So now, what should we do? What's the course of action that we should take? Before we contribute, we should know the clear picture. So that's the, as I repeatedly told, that's the idea behind this particular session today. So we have invited an expert who can contribute on this subject. If I have a problem in my construction site, we have various engineers who are expert in air conditioning sector, who are expert in electrical sector, who are expert in generator sector. If I have a problem beyond my expert area, it is my duty to call them and get some knowledge out of these people and find the answer. So we should do the same thing if you're having any trouble, if you're having any problem, even if it is an economic crisis, economic problem. So that's why we need an expert here. Now we have a wonderful expert engineer who can contribute today on this particular subject, Professor Vidura Tennako. In order to give a proper introduction, I would like to invite Engineer Sampath Godamune, who has been a very active member of Building Services Engineering Sectional Committee, so far contributing on various subjects. Engineer Sampath Godamune, over to you to give the introduction of today's presenter.
Thank you, Engineer Jagat. We have today engineer turned economist available here to discuss today about the current economic crisis. He is Professor Vidura Tennako, and basically he is an electrical engineer, graduated from Faculty of Engineering, University of Peradeniya, and later he moved into the field of economics, and he was the head of department at the Money and Banking Division of the Economic Research Department of the Central Bank. And later, Professor Vidura Tennako got his PhD from Washington State University of USA, and currently he is working as a professor at Indiana University in USA. And he has published many articles in peer-reviewed journals, and he do have a lot of interest in econometrics, statistics, and health economics. And in the same time, he has already been invited by many international media to give his expert opinion on current economic crisis of Sri Lanka. And on top of that, I must be very much thankful to Professor Vidura Tennako regarding one very important thing. Sometimes you may know he's a blogger. He's a blogger. He has written thousands of articles in Sinhala language. According to his blog page, I think more than 200 or 250 articles he has written with in economics, but everything was written in Sinhala language. I think he has spent a lot of his professional time to educate the public, especially Sri Lankans. So I think we do have the very ideal person today available here. Professor Vidura Tennako, we must be very much thankful to you for accepting our invitation in a short time. And I hope, ladies and gentlemen, we will have a wonderful session today, because we will get a very insight of what has really happened to this country. And in the same time, according to the Professor Vidura's own words, he will present you everything on fact base. That he is having all the figures, and he's having every information to prove what he explained here is completely true and correct. So, Professor Vidura Tennako, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sampath, for your generous introduction and also for the invitation. IESL is the very first professional organization I was affiliated with, and later, now I am affiliated with many other professional organizations, particularly related to economics and econometrics. And this is the first chance I had to formally address a large audience of engineers. Thank you again. Right. So today's topic is the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, roots, current status, and the way forward. And most of you who are here attending this session are engineers, but there are others also, not say this was open to public. And all of you are here because you do care, you worry what is happening, and you have a concern about what is happening here, and you are thinking what we can do. And it was mentioned correctly to decide what I can do, I mean, as an individual. So first you need to have an idea what is going on. So what are the roots of the problem, where it went wrong. And I am not in a better position than any of you to make judgments. You all can make decisions. The difference between me and many of you probably is you are trained and you have experience in different fields. I have more exposure and to the subject of economics. And I try to present more facts and more numbers as much as possible, rather than making conclusions. And you are free to use the same facts and numbers and to think differently, right? First, before moving forward, this is a usual disclaimer. So I will not read the entire thing to save time, but for the record, I will have it, since this is recorded, right? It is not easy to pack the entire story in a presentation to be completed within less than 2 hours. This is a very broad area. I can spend the entire session on one slide itself, but I will try to do it as fast as possible and try to explain the things in a simple language as much as I can. Okay. So you know what this picture is. This is the DeLorean of Doc Brown from Back to the Future. So I use that to use the time machine to go back and forth in the time domain, and also from one place to another. So let's go to April 4th, 2022, just 3 weeks ago. We know that's the day, a sad day for Sri Lanka. That's the day that the Minister of Finance in Sri Lanka announced that although the government has taken extraordinary efforts to remain current on its external indebtedness, it is now clear that this is no longer a tenable policy. So simply, we declared we have no way to pay back our debt. Right. And now the dollar has reached 360 rupees. This is increasing every day, so nobody knows what it will be next week. And interest rates has reached 24. These are the treasury bill rates, short-term treasury bill rates. Inflation, the recent number was, most recent number was 29.8%, and the food inflation was 46.6%. And there are queues everywhere, no gas, no petrol, no electricity. So we are worried what is happening and what has happened. So in particular, how did the country get into this mess, and where did things go wrong? Right. To start digging into the problem, let's look at the balance sheet of Sri Lanka. Many of you may have an idea what the balance sheet is. So that is the position of an entity's assets, total assets and liabilities. We look at the balance sheet of a company. The same way we can look at the balance sheet of a country. So we have some numbers, and these are the most recent numbers released few days or a week ago. These are the numbers as at end 2021. The assets and liabilities of a country are categorized here, as usual, under 4 categories. First, the general government. So the general government has, these are foreign liabilities, the total amount of the liabilities of Sri Lanka to the rest of the world, and the assets mean foreign assets. Okay, so we have 27 billion plus liabilities by the government, and no assets here. So on net basis, there's a liability of over 27 billion. And the central bank. Okay, if we look at the other sectors, so This is the government, and the other sectors outside the banking sector. Total liabilities are 25 billion and the assets is 2.6 billion. So there's a shortage of 22.5 billion. So usually when a business or an individual doesn't have enough resources, they go to a bank, they go to the banking system. Even when a country needs assets, the banking assets, but now when we look at the status of the banks, commercial banks particularly, the total liabilities were 7.1 billion and the assets were 2.98 billion. So there is a shortage of over 4 billion US dollars. When a bank has a problem, bank goes to the central bank. So that's the last resort. But now in Sri Lanka, the central bank also is in trouble. Central bank has 3.1 billion in its assets. This is not there anymore. I mean, this is the status at the end of December, but now after 4 months, it is much less, but let's start with this. And the liabilities were 4.8 billion. So that was a net shortage of 1.7 billion US dollars. So now, not just the private sector and the government, or not even the banking sector, central bank itself is in a problem. Central bank itself is struggling to pay back its own debt. So before helping anyone else, central bank needs to make sure that it can pay back its own assets. So if we add all these numbers, that adds to the total liabilities amounting to 64.5 billion US dollars, with assets equal just to 8.7 billion. So there is a shortage of 55 billion US dollars. This also is not a full explanation of the gravity of the problem, because there are many other things going on. I will not spend time, but just look at this number. So simply, as the first fact, the key point one, Sri Lanka has accumulated more financial liabilities than assets. That's very clear. I think with the numbers, you are clear. The next question is, why should we worry? Okay. One might say, when we look at a country in particularly, if some countries have, say, more assets than liabilities, some other countries should have more liabilities than assets. So that's a fact. So if we owe another country certain amount, that country has some assets over its liabilities. So overall, when we look at all the countries in the world, they should balance. So this is we call a zero-sum game. So they should balance. So some countries are naturally credited, some countries are debtors. So if that is the case, Sri Lanka being one of those debtor nations doesn't necessarily mean something very strange. So these are the largest debtors in the world, and these are the largest creditors in the world. So if we look at USA is the largest debtor. So its net position, we call that net international investment position. There is a difference between the countries' total assets and liabilities. So these are the numbers at the end of 2020. So but if we look at the most recent numbers, there's a similar picture. So USA has 14. So compared to that, this 50 billion is nothing. Okay, and there are other countries like Spain, Euro area, Australia, Brazil. There are many debtor nations. And on the other hand, there are some creditor nations like Japan at the top of the list, Germany and China, Hong Kong, Norway, Singapore. Some countries are in a positive position. So this is not something uncommon. Then what is unique, or what is the problem with Sri Lanka? The problem lies here. So many of you are engineers, you are good at numbers. So we need to look at the right numbers, right? So that is the net position, but the net position is the result of two numbers, the gross positions. That's the difference between assets and liabilities. So if we look at one of the countries in this group, obviously they have more assets than liabilities. If we look at the ratio, that is more than 1. So some countries have, if we take China, for example, China has 30% more assets than its liabilities. Hong Kong has 52%, Japan has 45%, Saudi Arabia has more than twice. Okay. If we look at the other group of countries, they have the ratio is less than 1. However, look at the ratio of the USA, that is 70%, UK 95%, France 92%. In most countries, even though the assets are less than the liabilities, the ratio is not very far from 1. Now, when a country has more liabilities than its assets, that means if all these say countries who has liabilities on one of these countries come back to this country, for example, all these other countries comes to US and ask this money back, which doesn't happen in reality, but this is an imaginary situation. USA doesn't have enough resources to pay it back. Okay, but that itself is not a problem, because all these say people who have lent to a country will not come back and ask that money back. Only some of the money needs to be paid during a given time. So as long as there are enough resources for that, or in other words, if you can manage your cash flow, you are fine. This is true for a company or an individual. As long as you have a cash flow, you are fine. So you can manage your high liabilities compared to assets using your cash flow. But if the assets drop below a certain threshold of your liabilities, as you will understand, you will be in trouble. So you need to have sufficient assets to cover your liabilities. So what is that sufficient amount? That is, a country has to decide that. Okay. In case of Sri Lanka, this is the status. This is status. For each, say, a $100 liability, Sri Lanka just has, say, 13% of that, 13.6%. So that is the status of Sri Lanka. If you look at some of the countries which faced balance of crisis payments like Greece or Turkey, the number is low, very low, but still above 40%, not this low, right? And this is another number. I will not spend a lot of time on this slide. So basically, we have some reserves, but when we look at the what we call reserve-related liabilities, it is a negative position. That is the status of the central bank. That was the status of the central bank by the end of last year, end of December. But now the situation is worse. Right. The key point too: if a country does not have financial assets to match its financial liabilities, the country must rely on cash flow, because you don't have enough assets. You rely on incoming cash flow to pay back your debt, right? Right. So that's the first issue of having more liabilities than assets. But that is not the only issue. When we look at this with a long-term perspective, asset is something generates you some income. When you have assets, you have invested somewhere. For your investments, you earn something during each period. On the other hand, you need to pay something for liabilities. So for liabilities generate negative cash flows, and assets generates positive cash flows. When we look at this dimension, some countries which has more assets and more liabilities than assets also are not in a bad shape as Sri Lanka. So let's look at USA. USA has 32 trillion in assets, but the liabilities are 46 trillion. So the assets are just 70% of the liabilities. However, on these assets, US earns a higher return, higher interest rate, because they are invested in at places where USA can earn a higher yield. But on the other hand, for liabilities, USA pays a very low interest. As a result, this 32 trillion generates more revenue than what USA needs to pay for this 46 trillion. So if we look at the numbers for 2020, for this 32 trillion assets, USA received 958 billion and I think yes, 958 billion, and for payments for the liabilities, it just paid 776 on a net basis. US had a positive cash flow, even though it had more liabilities than its assets. That's exactly the reason why USA maintains a negative net position, because it is cheaper for USA to borrow. So USA borrow funds at a cheaper rate and invests and earn a higher yield. On the other hand, if we look at a country like China, China has more assets than liabilities. However, when we look at the cash flow from its assets, it earns less than what it pays for its liabilities. So on net basis, the position is negative. Exactly because of that reason, China needs to have more assets than its liabilities. Otherwise, the cash flow cannot be balanced. So this is the second dimension. What is the status if we look at Sri Lanka? So we know Sri Lanka has 64 billion in liabilities and just less than 10 billion in assets. And these assets are, say, saved for liquidity purposes, and we don't earn much interest, much return on these assets, and we can't invest these limited resources on a long-term basis. So we earn very little interest income. But on the liabilities, we need to pay a very high interest. So the result is we pay a lot more on our liabilities than our assets. So in 2019, we received 252, these should be millions, okay? Millions, okay? 52 million US dollars and 13 million US dollars. So this is a mistake. This should be millions. Okay. If we look at any other year, that is the same. So each year we are spending more on our liabilities, and as we accumulate more liabilities, this amount is going to increase. So this is the second issue. If a country does not have sufficient financial assets to back its financial liabilities, the result is a continuous cash outflow. Each year we need to say pay something on that. Okay. The next important question: how did the country get into this mess, and when did things go wrong? So my objective is not to blame anyone or say, so this is, I try to troubleshoot so that the problem can be identified. Without identifying the correct issue, it is hard to address the issue. So we need to have a good understanding about the problem. Many people say this is something happened during the last 74 years, and every government contributed to the problem. If someone says so, I do agree. I do agree, because this is not something happened in a year. So the contribution during each period was not the same, but this started almost at the independence, or maybe 1 year before, in 1947, when Mr. J.R. Jayawardena became the finance minister in 1947. I can say one thing for sure using facts. I will have more slides to prove my point. That is, we did not have this problem in 1948 or 1947 when we got independence. So this is not a problem we inherited from our colonial rulers. This is a problem we created. This is a homegrown problem. When we got independence, so this is when the central bank was established in 1950. So we have statistics at central bank from that year onwards. When the central bank was established in 1950, we had 900% of our total external debt as our reserve. So for each $1 of debt we had more than $9 of external assets to pay back our debt. So 9 to 10%. Okay. And this decreased gradually during the very first years, because from the beginning, our strategy was to spend more than the government's strategy was to spend more than what the government earned. So the problem started even before I was born. So during the very first 15 years after independence, governments were spending more than it was earning, but we had a cushion. We had a say reasonable reserve. We used the reserve. Since we used the reserve, we were not. There was no need to borrow because we were using reserves. Reserves decreased very fast, very gradually, and by 1963 or 64, the net position, our external liabilities exceeded our external assets. So far, we had a positive position. Okay, and then continuously since then, we are in the negative territory. So this did not happen very recently. So if we, okay, so the external position of the country was very healthy at the independence, but the statist and nationalists policies, I will explain why I use these terms, change the status within 15 years. Okay, one way that is a choice of people, because people preferred this type of ideologies, and this was the end result. So these are the numbers until 1976, because 1976-7 is considered by many people as another, say, important point. I use these numbers to show that the problems did not start in 1977. So these are the numbers before 1976. So at the beginning, we had a lot more assets than our liabilities. And the assets decreased gradually and the liabilities increased. And even in 1963, we had more foreign assets than liabilities, but the position changed to a net negative position in 1964. Now, we were in trouble at that time. For the first time, we were struggling with balance of payment crisis. We could not pay back our, say, dues. We did not have enough foreign reserves. We had to go to IMF. And we went to IMF first around this time. So the first loan was taken in around these years. I have the exact times in next slide. And we continued to go to IMF, and things became worse, particularly. So in 1970-77, the foreign reserves as a percentage of foreign liabilities dropped to somewhere around 10%. So we had many difficulties. The country had to limit all the imports, and people had to go through many, say, sufferings, and the liabilities increased significantly. So this is the beginning of the IMF era. We are in, so since this time, we are in an IMF era. So far, we have gone to IMF 16 times. Most of the years since this time, we were under the supervision and under the support of IMF until now. Right. So when the foreign reserve cover of foreign liabilities drops, it is impossible to defend the exchange rate. That is a fact. That is a fact. So people are worrying why the rupee continues to depreciate. So initially, until 1965 or 1966, the exchange rate of the country was maintained at a specific level, 4 rupees and 76 cents for US dollars, or the US dollar was basically, say, Sri Lankan rupee. Okay, so this is the price of Sri Lankan rupee in terms of US dollars. You could exchange a US dollar for 22, for 22 US dollars, you could buy someone could buy a Sri Lankan rupee. On the other hands, using 1 rupee, we could purchase $1. When the foreign reserves were not sufficient to support this, the exchange rate had to be depreciated, and this was done continuously. So that is what the IMF does. When a country struggles with a balance of payment crisis, the underlying reason is the actual value of the currency, Sri Lankan rupee, is not as what we state. So IMF helps, or IMF advises to depreciate the currency. When the currency value of the currency is depreciated, then it comes to a balance. So this happened continuously, right? So this is a zoomed in picture after 1964. What happened after 1964? Now, if we look at the ratio, this is the ratio of total foreign assets to total external debt. It has always been below 1. Not that it has always been below 1. We have been maintaining since 1970 at least reserves somewhere around 20% of our liabilities. I mean, there were fluctuations, but it has always been less than 40%, sometimes even less than 20%. So it looks like we thought that 20% is sufficient. And we somehow managed. These red lines represents the years we were in an IMF program. The blue lines show when we were not in IMF program. So if you look at this, you will see very clearly we have been under IMF programs in more years than not. Okay, so most of the years we were under IMF programs. That is exactly how we managed to survive with such a low ratio of assets to our liabilities. Because we have 100 rupees in debt. We just have 20 rupees at hand, and both this 20 rupees and 100 rupees are changing. So they are cash flows. So if someone asks us, say 20 rupees, less than 20 rupees, we can pay. But if someone asks us to pay back more than 20 rupees, we don't have enough money. We are stuck. But since IMF was there to support us, we could survive because we borrowed from IMF until the temporary liquidity problem was solved. But then, but the underlying structural problem was not solved. This is very important because even after this crisis somehow will be solved, it is very much likely that we will go back to an equilibrium like this. We will be okay, but it does not guarantee that we will have to go back to the IMF after some years because this is a long-term issue. It did not start in 1977. What happened in 1997 was a kind of a solution to this. So that was say approach to address the issue, but that also was not successful. Right. So this was the situation. So one way we can say Sri Lanka managed to say survive simply because of IMF support, and without IMF support we would not be surviving during the last 50 years. Okay, and the conclusion we can make is, okay, then the reason for current troubles is this time Sri Lanka decided not to seek IMF assistance because that equilibrium was only possible with the support of IMF. This time we decided not to go to IMF. Now the question is why we did not go to IMF. This was kind of a political decision. So to me, it is highly illogical. It doesn't make sense. Okay. Anyway, that was a decision. But to understand what happened, first I need to explain some concepts, clarify some concepts. This was not something many people were clear maybe 2 years ago, but I think now people understand what this means. First, the difference between public debt and foreign debt. Public debt is, I call I use the term loosely to mean the debt by the central government, but strictly speaking, public debt includes the debt by other public entities like state-owned corporations, etc. But because I can't find comparable numbers, I stick to central government debt. So public debt is basically the government by the debt by the government. And government debt includes both domestic debt and foreign debt. And then foreign debt is the debt of the country. It is not the debt of the government. So the foreign debt includes the debt of the central government and other entities. Okay, so this is the status. So these are two different things. We should not mix them. We should not mix them, right? And this is the public debt stock as at end 2021. Very recent numbers, just released this week. Okay, this week or last week. So at the end of 2021, again, I'm pretty sure this number has reached 20 trillion now, but this was the number at the end of December, because the foreign debt particularly was converted to rupees using the previous exchange rate, $200. But now if we use the current rate, 360, this itself will be 10 trillion. Okay, so foreign debt was 6.4992 billion. Okay, and the rest was domestic debt. And out of the domestic debt, say 2 trillion was from the central bank, 4 trillion was from the other commercial banks, and 4.8 trillion was from the non-banking sector. So this is the breakdown. Now I convert these numbers into rupees to US dollars using the exchange rate prevailed at end 2021. So that means at approximately 200 rupees. So if I convert, this is equal to 31 or 32 billion US dollars, and this is equal to 10 billion US dollars. This is 88 billion US dollars. Keep in mind, it does not mean, so this is public debt, this is not foreign debt. So most of this debt is in rupees. I just converted the numbers to dollars, because whether we express that in rupees or dollars, it's just a number. And part of that is in dollars and part of that is in rupees. Here we express everything in rupees, here we express everything in dollars. So this is the number. Now let's look at the balance sheet of Sri Lanka. We just looked at. Okay, we just looked at. So this is what I explained earlier. So what does that mean? So if I go back to this foreign debt is foreign debt by definition. That is foreign debt of the government. And then Sri Lanka has, the government has borrowed equivalent of 10 billion, okay, not necessarily in dollars, but equivalent of 10 billion from the central bank. And central bank has, on net basis, central bank has, say, net liabilities to rest of the world equal to 1.7 billion US dollars. This amount is much higher than that. So that means practically, indirectly, central bank has borrowed money and lent to the government. So we can interpret it that way. Okay. The same way, if you look at commercial banks have lent 20 billion, equivalent of 20 billion US dollars to the government. And banks have borrowed from the rest of the world over 4 billion in net basis. So again, it is clear that money has been borrowed from the rest of the world and lent to the government. And if we look at other sectors, same 22 billion here, this is 23 billion. So practically what it means is, even though only this amount is recorded as government's, say, foreign liabilities, indirectly, the foreign liabilities of other sectors also with the government, because government is ultimately responsible for this total amount of foreign debt, not just its own. So this total liability ultimately is directly or indirectly government's liability. So that can be explained in other ways also. So for example, so out of the domestic debt, so what is something listed as domestic debt, 4.6% is the international sovereign bonds owned by resident investors. Okay, so these are directly say denominated in dollars, and then development bonds, another 5.4%. So if I add these two components together, it is 10%. So these are direct in dollars, not indirectly, direct in dollars, but they are recorded under domestic debt. So this was not done like 2 years ago. Recently, in the statistics, these numbers were classified as domestic debt rather than foreign debt. And the majority is treasury bills and treasury bonds. Now we have less investments in very small number of amount of investments in bills and bonds by foreign investors. However, indirectly, say what has happened is banks or the central bank or individuals have borrowed from foreigners and converted those dollars to rupees and lent to the government. So ultimately, so most of that is foreign borrowings. Now this is a comparison. So this is the total public debt in after converting to dollars, and this is the total external debt. So you can see what has happened. So one way, so when the total public debt increased, total external debt in the 1960s until 1965 did not translate into external debt because we had reserves. We had enough reserves. Reserves are used then from foreigners on net basis. And after 77, this increased, the foreign borrowings increased, and it was somewhat say stagnant until say around 2006 or 2007, and approximately after the end of Civil War, this foreign borrowing component increased significantly. When we look at the government's debt statistics, we don't see this because this is not direct. So this, I mean, there was a change, some change happened somewhere around 2010, which is very important. I will explain. So with that, it looks like the government does not have enough debt because these are not recorded in government's debt statistics, but indirectly, government accumulated a lot of foreign liabilities. I will explain how, right? The important points, point 7 is external liabilities of Sri Lanka are external liabilities of Sri Lankan government, either directly or indirectly. So one can argue it is not the government that is responsible, but I think my logic is clear. Indirectly, all foreign debt, foreign liabilities are government's own liabilities, right? And I mentioned this is something started at the independence. I have here the Sri Lankan and Ceylonese governments say income and expenditure numbers from 1821 for 200 years. I'm not sure whether anyone else has these numbers in this form. So these are the government's fiscal operations since 1821 for 200 years. Now you can see clearly the difference. So this is 1948. So if this is one means we spend less than what we earn, less than the income. Okay, if it is red, that means the government spends more than its income. So until independence, the Ceylonese governments always spent less than its income, and the remaining balance was saved. That was saved And that is what helped us to accumulate a reserve. When we have a reserve, this is a strategy followed by many other countries, even now. So for example, Singapore is one of the dream country of many Sri Lankans. This is the strategy followed by Singapore and continue to follow even until today. I have some slides from Singapore. I'm not sure whether I will have enough time, but if I have time, I will initially after 1821, because of a lot of expenditure on war, etc. The Ceylonese government was making losses, but very soon they found innovative ways. They introduced, they first tried to say cultivation as a commercial product, but it was not successful. Then they tried various other crops. They introduced coffee failed, then they introduced tea. All this, they thought about ways to raise the income, and somehow they managed their expenses and save. So during certain years, it was unavoidable to have a budget deficit. The government had to spend more than its revenue, but it was not a problem because there were enough accumulated reserves. A part of that reserves could be used to cover the deficit. There was no need to say borrow from someone else. And not only that, the reserves generated more income. So it was, say, when you have liabilities, it is a burden on the budget. But when you have assets, so it helps the budget. That is another source of income in addition to the tax revenue. So this was the situation until 1947. But since 1947, each year, except in these 2 years, 1954 and 55, particularly and initially from 1947 and then again from 1956, each successive government spent more than the revenue. When this is not balanced, it's obvious this is not sustainable, because if the government needs to manage its debt sustainably, it can run a deficit during 1 year, but then it needs to somehow maintain a surplus. Otherwise, it keeps on accumulating debt. And this came to a level that last year, for each 100 rupees of income, the government spent 242 rupees. So how can a country survive when we spend 2.42 times what we earn? So this became very severe during the most recent years, right? And this is another graph, important graph. I told you something happened around 2009. What happened was until around 2010, most of the foreign debt of the country were the central government debt. But around 2011, the country started to follow a different strategy. As a result, foreign debt was accumulated outside the central government. The government used a strategy. So this is what caused the current trouble beyond what happened since independence. So this is the second main issue. I will explain this again. The first part I think is clear. So the point is, until 2010, external debt was mostly government debt, but not from 2011. So you can see the graph. So if you look at the central government's foreign debt, it is not unusual. But when you look at the total external debt, we see an unusual jump after 2010. And I already explained that this external debt of other entities also is indirectly a part of government's debt, right? How this was done? This was done by intentionally, as a strategy, intentionally appreciating the currency, appreciating the value of the rupee. So people were very happy. So this was a big plus point for the government. Even now, people worry when the price of the dollar increases. Always when the price of the dollar increases, people in Sri Lanka, most Sri Lankans think that is a bad sign, something wrong is happening. In a way that's correct. So depreciating the currency is not bad. However, say we need to make sure that the currency rupee should be appreciated. We need to take measures to ensure currency will appreciate, but it should be done the proper way, not using shortcuts. So, for example, say you need to do daily physical exercises to stay healthy and avoid a heart attack. But when you have a heart attack, you should not run to the treadmill. You should run to the hospital. Okay, that's not the time for say to be in treadmill. So what we did was when we had heart attacks, we ran to the treadmill. So it is something like that. So what happened around 2010? So around 2010, the price of the dollar was maintained low as a strategy to attract more debt capital. Okay, so around this time, the interest cost on foreign debt was around 2.7%. So as you can see, the interest cost on foreign debt has increased gradually. That is another point, because the more liabilities we have, it becomes more harder to borrow more. So people worry about the risk. They will still lend, but they will demand a higher interest rate. So gradually, so particularly since 2005 or 2006, the interest rate we pay on our liabilities also increase. So one way the liabilities increase, on the other way the interest rate we have to pay on liabilities also increase. So so there were two factors contributing to the negative cash flow. Okay, so you can see, because until this time mostly it was concessional loans. And then the domestic interest rates, since we were printing money, we had inflation. When there's inflation, naturally the value of the domestic value of the currency drops, and as a result, interest rates increase. So around this time, the interest rate was 11.56. Okay, the interest cost on foreign finances was 2.7%. Under this situation, okay, keep in mind, this is very important. Under this situation, if I invest $100 in Sri Lankan treasury bills, okay, so I'm a foreigner, I bring US dollars and I invest in say Sri Lankan treasury bills, I earn more than 11%. Okay, so but if I invest in my money in US or in one of the Western countries around this time, I had almost zero interest, because the interest rates were very low. Okay, maybe 0.5% or even less. This time it was close to 0% on T-bills. So I receive 11%. So if this is the situation, usually, okay, usually the interest rates in Sri Lanka are high. Now it is 24%, for example, 24%. But in USA, it is much less. It is less than 1%. So we should expect people to bring dollars to Sri Lanka and invest in T-bills. But why don't they do that? Why foreigners do not jump on to take the advantage of the opportunity and bring a lot of US dollars to Sri Lanka? The reason is, okay, I may earn 24%, but I need my money back in dollars. Okay, so I invest in rupees, I earn an interest, then my initial investment and the interest needs to be converted back to dollars. By that time, if the price of a dollar has increased by more than 24%, I am going to lose. Okay, so think about the situation now. So if I invest in US in T-bills, I earn 24%. That's the interest rate now, and I will earn a 24% interest after annually after 3 months. So that means after 3 months, I will receive 6% more. That is a huge interest, huge return. But the dollar depreciates by more than that 6%. So that means on net basis, I am going to lose. In general, in general, there should be a balance between these two factors. Okay, the exchange rate should depreciate by an amount equal to the interest rate differential. Otherwise, capital flows in one direction, so that is not sustainable. So this time, the exchange rate should have depreciated by say 10 or 11%. But what really happened was that the exchange rate appreciated from 2009 to 2011. If we look at the 2 years together, it dropped to 110, and it was almost at the same level from 2008 until 2011. Interest rate was exchange rate was around the same time. So that means if someone brings dollars to the country, they can earn a higher return in rupees, and they can convert it back to dollars at the same rate and earn the high return. So this was used as a strategy to attract capital during this time. Okay, the difference it made was before that people invested in Sri Lanka expecting a real return. They invested in a company, for example, expecting that the company will grow, earn revenue, and they can have dividends or whatever. But now they bring dollars on speculation, because the central bank has kind of guaranteed that the exchange rate will be maintained at this level, and the TB rate is high. So they are kind of gamblers. They bring money because they know if the exchange rate depreciates, they will lose. But say knowing that, they bring in money. And then how this exchange rate was maintained? Exchange rate was maintained using that money, because that money was released to the economy, and the dollar supply increased. When the dollar supply is increased, not through natural flows. So what I mean by natural flows is what comes by exporting something or through foreign remittances or something. They are natural flows. But these are financial flows which will go out at any moment. They are borrowings. Okay, borrowings were used to maintain the exchange rate. So this caused most of these troubles, because this is not sustainable. This was not sustainable, and this was done. And this is some theory. There is a well-known theory that we call the impossible trinity. So that means the country cannot have all three things together. So they are having a fixed exchange rate, having a sovereign monetary policy, that means the ability to print money, and free capital mobility. So a country can have only two of these things at a given time. So usually the official stated policy of Sri Lanka is to have free capital mobility to some extent, at least with some limitations, and sovereign monetary policy, because we have a central bank, not a currency board. We have a sovereign monetary policy. Then we can achieve this third target. But we try to achieve both these targets. When we try to achieve both these targets, we had to restrict the movement of capital. So in 70 to 77, imports were restricted, because the exchange rate was somewhat fixed and the money printing continued. And more recently, we had to do that because this was not achievable. But during this time, the central bank, at least temporarily, tried to achieve all three targets. So these are the periods. So from like 2008 to 2011, etc. And then the exchange rate could not be maintained at that level. Within a very short period, it depreciated. Then it was tried again. And more recently, that was tried again. However, during this period, this was done. As a result, capital, say, flowed into the country, not necessary to the government, but through various other ways. So the dollars flowed into the country was converted to rupees and government borrowed in rupees. So what happened to the dollars? What happens to the dollars? Because we had surplus dollars. Because of the surplus dollars released to the economy, the price of the dollar was artificially low. Okay, since the price of the dollar was artificially low, the imports were popular, imports increased. So for example, say now I think the price of a gas cylinder is I think close to 5,000 rupees. So it used to be around 1,500 or so. So what does that mean? This 5,000 rupees is the actual cost of a gas cylinder. I mean, it can be more, it can be higher, but let's say as an example, that is the actual price. So somehow you receive a gas cylinder at 1,500. When you can purchase something, you can, I mean, something costs $5,000 at 1,500, you keep on demanding that. So when the price is high, $5,000, many people, I mean, very soon, if the price increases to maybe, if the price of a gas cylinder will increase to 7,000 or 8,000 or 10,000, at some point, there will not be any queues because people cannot afford to buy a gas cylinder simply. So then there will not be queues. But now there are queues because still there are people who can purchase that when the price is very low, not just gas like petrol or anything, electricity, whatever. So when the price is too low, you keep on consuming. So as a result, the imports increase significantly. So people say we are importing more than what we export. There is a symptom. That is not the problem. The problem is having say exchange rate, having the exchange rate maintained too low. So think about other expenses. So I mean, from the point of view most of you will feel, okay, I have saved like 10 million to send my son to do some foreign degree. But now its dollar value has dropped by 50% problem in a different way. You could send your children for foreign education at a rate, paying a rate 50% cheaper. So many people were sending money. So this way, the demand for dollars increased beyond the supply, and the gap was filled using debt. So continuously borrowings close the gap. And when this happens, exports, remittances, and other returns for investments. So these are the current transfers. And this excludes financial transactions, which are reversed at account balance. Balance grew up significantly. So that means each period, the country needs more dollars than it earns through natural means. So this balance in the current account was covered using the inflows to the financial accounts. So that means debt. And as a result, the debt accumulated. So if particularly after, say, around 2005 particularly, and until 2019, and this is a kind of a statistical issue. This does not mean that that decreased in 2020. So that is something, the way numbers are reported. As you can see, the foreign assets increased somewhat compared to this period, but the liabilities increased significantly more than that. So anyway, the liabilities were growing, but the phase of that the growth in liabilities accelerated significantly after, say, this period, somewhere around 2007. Okay, 2007. Okay, the key point 9, during 2010 to 12, the price of a dollar was suppressed as a strategy to attract more dollars. And this strategy resembled the Ponzi scheme. Ponzi scheme means something, and in Sri Lankan terms, it is like a Sakviti type of game. So you pay back your debt using new debt, and then in this case especially, what happened was you use your say cash inflows, dollar inflows, to maintain the dollar, and the price of the dollar is used as a strategy to attract more dollars. So this is a cyclical thing. So this should explode at some point. So this was a Ponzi scheme in economics. In economic models, we always have a condition called, say, no Ponzi scheme, because we want to make sure that this is stable. Okay, this is stable. This cannot, I mean, say, engineers know what we call an unstable equilibrium. So if something diverge and does not converge, that is not stable. Okay, right. So why they wanted to do that? So what they tried to achieve was high economic growth. Through that, we could achieve very high economic growth during 2010 and 2012. So the average growth during these 3 years was 8.5%, and there were many investments during these periods after post-war. So there was economic growth. So many of you are in the construction field. Personally, you would have been happy personally, and say professionally, you would have been happy. There was huge growth. But as a fact, the economic growth in a capitalist country is not driven by the government or the central bank. It is determined by the ability of the economy or the society to absorb technology and improve efficiency. And long term, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I have limited time. Long term, the growth is not determined by the fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus can boost the growth in the short run, but unless it allows the other side of the circle, it is going to collapse. That is exactly what happened. So around from 2013 onwards, the economy started to collapse. So if we look at the 5-year average of the economic growth, it is below 2% for the first time since independence. It was always at least about 2%, even during the worst times. 5-year average was at least 3%. The average was close to, say, average was 3.7% until 1977 and 4.8% after that, but now it has dropped to below 2% mark. Okay. Right. So the other thing is, again, I mentioned earlier, when the liabilities grow, that also affects the cash flow. So when there are more liabilities, expenses on foreign liabilities increase, and income from foreign assets did not increase because the assets did not increase. So each year we had an additional net cash outflow other than what we earn. Okay, so the fiscal stimulus can accelerate growth in the short run, but at the risk of long-term stability. Okay. Right. And so after 2015, the government's strategy was to stabilize this, and for that it tried to maintain increase revenue and limit expenditure. And in 2017 and 2018, the government managed to maintain a primary surplus. So that means during the year, the government did not spend more than it collected as revenue. However, overall budget deficit was still much higher because the government had to pay interest on the accumulated debt. So only during 5 years, the primary balance was maintained positive. That was 1954 and 55. But then we did not have accumulated debt. So because of that, overall budget deficit also was positive. And then it was balanced in 1992. And after that, the government showed very, very strong, fiscal discipline and limited its, expenses and raised revenue. But at the beginning, in 2015, just before the election, it raised the salaries of government employees, and there were other concessions. And in 2015, it spent more than its revenue. But during the 3 years, 2016 and 2017 and 18, it was mostly balanced. But 2019, again, that was election year, things changed. Okay. Overall, when we look at this period, government spent more than what it collected, but compared to other periods, there was some fiscal discipline because that was inevitable. So it was not possible to maintain the status of the economy without the collapse now we experienced, without taking such measures. So these numbers explain what happened during 2015 to 2019. This is not political, but I mean, this is a number to be explained, particularly because this gives some insight to what could happen in future, next years also. So for example, this is a widely quoted number. So I heard even I think the finance minister was referring to this number in the parliament. So by the end of 2015, public debt was 7.4 billion, 7.4 trillion. By the end of 2019, it was 13 trillion. So the question was, the public debt increased by 5.5 trillion. So the common question is, what did the government do? Because unlike the previous period, people did not see a lot of construction projects, so big developments. Then there was a problem. Okay, taxes were raised, and the public debt also increased. So what happened? It is not possible to say this money was used to pay debt, because this is the increase in debt. Okay, so whatever used to pay previous debt, say, should decrease debt, but this did not decrease. The debt was increased. So that is not a valid argument. Overall, none of the governments paid back its debt. So the total debt has accumulated since independence. So none of the governments has paid. Okay, so it is a massive Ponzi scheme in one way. And but the actual total sum of primary balances, the actual amount government spent over its earnings was 3.71 billion, right? And 320 of that was during 2015, and the interest payments and what was the remaining part? 3.6 trillion was interest payments on previous debt. And 1.5 trillion was the change in value, because the value of the foreign debt increases when the dollar depreciates. It does not mean that the government receives anything. So this is the only amount government had for spending on something. Okay, so this continues to happen. This continues to happen. This is true for other governments also. So the previous government also, 2004 to 2014, the public debt increased from 2.4 something to 7.4 by almost 5.5 trillion during that period also. But the government's spending, or central government's spending over revenue was 966 billion or something, if I remember the number correctly. The rest was the interest payments and the change in value. So this is a kind of a terrible situation, because you don't have any useful resources, but the debt keeps on increasing. So that's the nature of the problem. So every government in the ruled the country contributed to this debt stock. So this is a breakdown. I will not spend a lot of time on this. Okay, and this is the current account balance. So that is what happened in the fiscal sector. If we look at the external sector, during the previous 5 or 6 years, the government balanced, by allowing exchange rate to appreciate, government balanced the dollar inflows and outflows, except returns on existing liabilities. If we exclude existing liabilities, we have earned enough dollars than what we wanted for our expenditure. But because of the interest payments, we were in a negative position. Okay, so the key point 11, the stabilization policy measures during 2015 to 19 were insufficient to reverse the debt burden, even though we used some policies. So why this happened? So if we go to the root causes of this huge fiscal balance, there are many things, but to keep it short, I will point out few things. One thing is the gradual decrease in government revenue. Even though the GDP grew, the revenue did not grow. So as a percentage of GDP, the government's revenue was around 20 to 25% until 1990s. Since 1950, then it started to drop gradually. So this year in 2021, it is 8.7%. It is even less. It is just 8.7% of GDP. So people have income, but government doesn't have money. Simply say that income of people is not collected by the government. Government gets spent. So that's the main problem. Why it happened? One reason was the country becoming more domestic economy. So time Sri Lanka has becoming a economy not connected with the world. So even in 2000, our trade was close to 90% of the GDP. Now it is like, and this is exports. So exports has declined, and also imports. So people think we can restrict imports and increase exports. No, that doesn't work. So when say imports drop, exports also drop. So that goes together. So I can explain, but since I have limited time, I will just show the facts, but necessary I can show how it is connected. What is the effect? So if we go back to 1950, 60% of the government's revenue came from import and export taxes. 21% from income tax. Indirect taxes and all other income was just 19%. Okay, this is very important. So this was the structure of the colonial say governance structure that we inherited from British. Okay, so most of the income was through imports and exports. Since independence, each government had more domestic-oriented policies rather than promoting say export. We were trying to have a say strong domestic economy. So one of the biggest say casualties was the government's budget. So this part decreased. This part decreased gradually. Government's tax revenue, particular as a percentage. In say the government's revenue through this external sector dropped significantly, and after 77. The government tried to boost that a little bit, but then again somehow this decreased. Sri Lanka became a more domestic economy. Okay, so this is as a percentage of total revenue. When we look at the numbers as a percentage of GDP, you can see how it impacted government's revenue until 1990s. So the total revenue somehow was about 20% as a percentage of GDP. Okay, the ideally when the income grows, the percentage collected as income taxes should increase. It did not happen, and since the country became more a domestic economy, this component, large component through external trade decreased almost to zero. So the only remaining part was indirect taxes like GST, etc., the taxes on consumption. But that also was decreasing. So by this time, so now in 2021, it is further lower. So this dropped. So as a result, the government's tax revenue decreased. So the nationalist approach was a big burden on fiscal balance, and that's not the only reason. The other reason was the state-owned enterprises. So if we look at some of these big three, Sri Lankan, CPC, and CEB, so each year they are making huge losses. So So if we combine this, its current value is many billions of US dollars. So this is another factor. So these statist policies also were very costly. The fiscal deficit, nationalist and statist policies versus open policies. Okay, so then after the government change, there was a tax cut. Okay, this was a suicidal, say, strategy. It was very obvious that the debt sustainability is under threat when this happens. Even before that, the government was struggling to manage its budget. But in that situation, this tax cut was a big blow. Even in absolute numbers, the tax revenue dropped. Okay, so what happened was, in 2020, the revenue was 1.3 trillion. Expenditure was 3 trillion. I mean, even this was done after some manipulations in numbers. The actual number can be even higher. Okay, anyway, forget about that. So let's take this number. And in 2021, the total revenue in the budget, this is say big joke. I mean, each year a budget is presented at the parliament and get approved, but you never achieve the targets in the budget. So I mean, it is okay if the numbers are off by like 5% or 10%, but it is off by maybe 30 or 40%. Okay, so this is the total revenue, this is the expenditure, and this is deficit. This is the status of the government's budget during the last 2 years. If we look at the 2 years together, the revenue was 2.8 trillion and the expenditure was 6.5 trillion, and the shortage was 3.7 trillion. So from where did this money come from? So these are the credit from the central bank, total credit from the central bank by the end of 2019, and this is by end of 2021. So it increased from 363 billion to 2 trillion. So there is an increase of 1.7 trillion. And from the banking sector, another 1.7 trillion. So a total of 3.4 trillion was collected from the banking sector. Okay, banking sector. So out of this huge deficit. So in other words, this is money printing. So most of the budget balance was covered by borrowings from the banking sector. Okay. So if we look at the problem, so in 2020, the interest payments alone on liabilities was 980 billion, and 267 or US dollar 1.4 billion was as interest payment on foreign debt, and this amount is interest payment on domestic debt. And the interest payments alone was 72% of the revenue, 71.7% of the total revenue. So only 28% remains for all other expenses. If we look at the numbers, most recent numbers, 2021, again, we can see the same ratio. Okay, that is interest payments alone. It was more than 1 trillion. Right. So the key point 14, after tax cuts, it was obvious that Sri Lanka's public debt stock was unsustainable, and this was obvious to rating agencies, because when they, I mean, if it was obvious to me and many other economists, why not it was obvious to rating agencies? It was very obvious that the economy cannot be maintained in a stable equilibrium after this tax, and all rating agencies warned, and they downgraded Sri Lanka's default ratings. Central bank retaliated, and central bank made announcements complaining the action by the rating agencies rather than taking action. And when this was pointed out, and then it affected Sri Lanka's ability to borrow from foreign markets. Okay, and this is what happened in 2020 after COVID. So one common question is whether this happened due to COVID. So let's look at the numbers. So in current account, there are 4 components, 4 sub-accounts: goods account, that is import and export of goods, import, and then services, import and export of services, primary income. Primary income is, I mean, there are other things also, but this is mostly what we pay on our liabilities, simply on the liabilities we have. And the secondary income is migrant earnings, net migrant earnings. Okay, these are net positions. This is migrant earnings net less what we pay to say as outward remittances. So, for example, if a Sri Lankan student is studying abroad, you send money. That is an outward remittance, and then you receive inward remittances. This is the net position. Similarly, this is the net position of any receipts from the assets country has abroad, and the payments for any liabilities. And this is imports minus exports, and again from the services, imports minus exports. Okay, so the trade balance, if we take a year like 2019, the trade account had a shortage of 8 billion, and services covered, the tourism is here, services covered close to 3 billion, and the remittances covered another say close to 6 billion. So 6 plus, if I add these 2 numbers, it is more than this. Okay, so in other words, if we ignore this one, but we pay on our accumulated liabilities, during most of these years, we have had enough dollars, okay, except for the accumulated liabilities. So look at this. This is less. 2013 is higher than 1,883. So that means we had a positive current account balance if not for this. If we look at this year, again the same. If we look at this, they are almost balanced. If we look at this year, it is still negative if we subtract this, but the difference is not very large. 2019 again positive. Now look at 2020. 2020. This is the effect of the COVID. Because of COVID, the main impact we had was on services account, tourism. Okay, if not for COVID, we would have earned at least 2 billion here. So this could have been, so we can safely assume that it would have been 2.8. So that's a net loss of 2 billion. That's true. So, okay, that was a huge blow. However, at the same time, you can see the remittances increased somewhat, and the trade balance decreased. It was natural at many countries, I mean, in most countries, to have less trade because during the COVID, international trade somehow disrupted. So naturally, the imports would have gone down during 2020 anyway, even without any restrictions. Okay, so and there were restrictions also. Anyway, the point is in 2020, we did not have a huge current account deficit compared to the previous years. Okay, if not for this 2.2 on previous liabilities, we would have had a positive number. Then what went wrong? What went wrong was overall the current account balance was around 2 to 3 billion each year, and we financial account, particularly to financial account, each year we were managing with cash inflows to the financial account, which range from say 2 to 3 billion. Sometimes it can be more. We had a positive cash flow. So this was the usual thing. This is what stopped. This was the problem. So in 2020, the financial account, balance in the financial account turned negative. So in other words, we could not borrow. We could not borrow even as much as what we wanted to pay back. So that is where the country had a problem. And then in 2021, And 2021, the tourism recovered to some extent, but still there is something like 1 billion shortage. And the goods balance returned to where it was. And the secondary income dropped, like the remittances dropped due to some of the policy measures taken. So the loss was here like 1 billion, and another 1 billion increased 3.3 billion. We received some loans, some flows, but that was not sufficient. So overall, now during the last 2 years, we had 3 problems. One thing is the effect on tourism, and then a problem kind of we created, the problem with remittances. I will explain this. And then we could not borrow. This was the main issue. We could not borrow as we used to do during the past years. So the pandemic was a factor, but not the sole culprit. So this happened on top of what happened since independence. And when we look at money printing, so I'm not going to explain each number. So if I concentrate on this number alone, broad money. So broad money grew by 39.7% during the 2 years. That is the money supply. Money supply grew by 40%. Okay, the money supply increased by 39.7%, but during these 2 years, the GDP did not grow. GDP was stagnant. In 2020, GDP shrank by 3.6%, and 2021, it returned to where it was at the end of 2019. So basically, the goods and services produced within the country did not change during the 2 years. Okay, but the money supply increased by 40%. Okay, so 40%. Then what happens? The central bank, particularly during the last, during the six months program, okay, so since October, say last year, and even before that, and from the beginning, during the last 2 years, since central bank has adding money to the economy, keep on printing money, and then exchange rate was maintained at a fixed rate. Okay, I explained this is impossible, but last 2 times somehow it looked like things worked. It did not work, but say it did not continue for long enough to find the consequences. But this time, the same old trick was tried, but it failed. Okay, failed. So what happened? What happened here? Okay, so this is the drop in foreign remittances. Foreign remittances was around 675 million during January 2021, and it dropped to close to 200 million by February. And after allowing the exchange rate to say the value of the dollar to increase, now in March there is an increase. But one point of observation is not sufficient to make a strong conclusion. However, we see a change in the trend. Okay, so monetary and exchange rate policies are largely responsible for the crisis, but it very recently. Look at these numbers. Increase in NCG from the banking sector was 3.49 billion. So that means the government borrowed 5 billion from the banking sector. If we convert that at the rate of 200, the rate prevailed at the end of the previous year, it is 17.5 billion US dollars. Okay, so that means people have more money, but the production is as is. Now what happens? What happens? People have more money. They will try to import. They will demand imports because we do not have a local production to match with the increase in money supply. So one way it increases prices because the demand for goods and services is high, and on the other hand, On the other hand, the price of the dollar is cheap, so there's a demand for imports. And I think you will agree that when a Sri Lankan, most middle class, when they have money, what they do, they spend on a car. They spend money on a car, and they build a big house. So these are typical things. Okay? These are typical things. But now the vehicle imports are, say, restricted, and investing in a house also does not appear an attractive alternative due to increases in building materials, etc. But people do have money. Keep in mind, people do have money. Middle class have money, because this money should be somewhere. Okay, so they want to, and at the same time, people have realized that the value of the rupee is depreciating, diminishing. So they want to save this. They want to save this in a way they think that their value will be preserved. So they try to, directly or indirectly, somehow, they try to convert their rupees to dollars. So that has created an artificial demand for dollars. That is why this black market, Hawala or Untial, say, market has become so popular. People have enough rupees. They want to convert them to dollars, just not because they wanted dollars, not because they wanted to use those dollars immediately for something, but they just feel rupees are not worth. Okay, so when there are enough people within the country who are willing to pay a higher price for a dollar, whoever wants to send remittances to the country have an option to receive a higher price by using a Hawala Undial systems than using the banking channel. So as long as the domestic demand for dollars is there, Hawala systems also will be there. Okay, so that happens. Okay, and then okay, so this is the status. I mean, if we want to discuss the current status, this is the status at end February 2022, the most recent numbers. Foreign currency loans, securities, and deposits. These are the predetermined outflows. As principal payment, just before the default. Okay, as principal payment, the country had to pay 5.4 billion, and as interest payments, another 1.3 billion. So the sum was 6.8 billion. And banking system had a net short position equal to 2.2 billion. So that means they had committed selling dollars they did not have, simply. Okay, so they have promised to deliver dollars which they did not have. I mean, beyond what they had. So if we add these two numbers together, that is a total of over 9 billion. And when we look at the balance of payments, okay, so what can we expect? So whatever the number, that will be a shortage. Even if somehow we manage to balance our imports using the income through services and these say services account and the remittances, still we have this, we have to pay for our existing liabilities. So this will be a negative, and but altogether these are the total liabilities. So when we have to pay, we have short-term liabilities equal to 9 billion, and we don't have any guaranteed source of income. There was no other option but to declare, say, default, the possible default. So the default was inevitable. However, will the default solve the problem? Will default solve the problem? Not fully, because this 9 billion is not, I mean, the default is valid on government's commitments. Okay, government's commitments are not all of these commitments. Central bank still needs to make its payments. Central bank has its own liabilities, they need to be paid back. And other private sectors also need to pay back. So probably the default will allow to postpone paying 50% of that, but the remaining 50% still is there. So these are some numbers from the government, from Ministry of Finance. So in 2022, the total dues were 4.5 billion. In 2023, another 4.2 billion. So with the decision not to pay this principal and interest, so we have an immediate saving. I mean, that also will cause problems later, because anyway we need to pay, but immediately we save that, but still there's a shortage. And this default did not shock the market. Okay? So as you can see, usually when the default was announced, the price of the sovereign bonds in the secondary market should drop. But what happened was the opposite. It was dropped, reduced, decreasing fast. But once the default was announced, it kind of stabilized at a low level, because that means people who were holding sovereign bonds did not expect the government to pay it as promised anyway. Okay, so under the circumstances, the default was inevitable. And now this is the current position. So we need to see what will happen this year. So if we convert them to monthly numbers, so each month now the January numbers were there. I think yeah, January, I think. So for imports, the country had spent close to 2 billion per month. Like it was. Yeah, each month the country spends close to 2 billion on imports, maybe 1.9 billion, and from exports we earn just 1 billion. So we have a shortage of at least 800 or 900 million per month, and out of that, so far we receive around 300 million through remittances, and another maybe 200 million from tourism. So that is 500. So at the moment, as it stands, still there is a shortage of close to 300 to 500 million each month. So that is the status of the economy, current balance. And on top of that, so we need to pay back the accumulated debt. Even though we have said we will not pay on due date, at some point we need to pay it back. And what are the market expectations? So these are the yield rates for sovereign bonds in the international markets for secondary in the secondary market. As you can see, the yield rates were like 40% for the maturities. I mean the sovereign bonds maturing in 2025, and close to 23% even in the maturities. Say sovereign bonds maturing in 2030. So what this means is, at least 3 to 4 years, practically it is impossible to borrow from the international markets. I mean, if we want to borrow, we need to pay a huge interest. What is the situation in the domestic markets? In the domestic markets also now, the interest rates are very high. That is the rate at which people within the country are willing to lend to the government. So so if you have rupees, and if you want to invest for a higher return, you can invest for more than 20% for 20 years, or close to 25% for 15 years. Okay, that is the return. So that means market expects the interest rate to stay high for many more years. So that is the market expectation. No, even though market expectation is not always correct. And this is the short-term market, T-bill market, one of the most recent T-bill auctions. So you can see the pattern. So the central bank could, I mean, on behalf of the government, central bank could raise 78 billion for 3 months at the rate of 23.5%. But for 6 months, they could only raise 1.1 billion at this rate, 24 million. So that means in the domestic markets, people are lending for 3 months at this rate. But if they want to lend for 6 months, they expect a higher rate than 24%. In other words, market expects a higher rate than this rate. Okay. I don't know what the central bank's response would be. These are the market's expectations. So this is the status. So key point 19, the monetary policy is in the right direction, but the economy is still not away from the danger zone. So the central bank took the right decision by raising the interest rates, but at the rate the dollar is depreciating, this is not sufficient. And I do not necessarily mean that we should keep on interest rates, because the purpose of raising the interest rate is to help government to say borrow funds from individuals and firms without borrowing from the banking sector. Because if government borrows further more from the banking sector, it will decrease the value of money further. So it doesn't help. But at the same time, if even after raising the interest rate, if the government is unable to raise enough funds from individuals, and the only result is increases in government's interest expenditure, which requires further borrowings, this doesn't help. So it is a tricky thing. Right. So now finally, so that means, okay, so if we look at the government's budget, so I had the government's budget somewhere here, government's budget here. So, okay, so it's here. Okay, it's the government's budget here. This is government's budget. So how government's revenue is spent. Okay, so 72% of government's revenue is spent on interest payments alone. It is possible that this year. Why? Okay, why? Because the interest rates are now increasing in one way. In interest rates, T-bill rates have almost doubled. On the other hand, the T-bill stock also has increased by at least 20%. I mean, it is keep on increasing. So the net result is an increase in interest expenditure. So the government's total revenue may be needed just to pay interest alone, because we have stopped paying foreign debt and foreign interest, but still domestic debt alone may require most of the government's revenue. Okay. So let's forget about interest payments. So for somehow, I don't know how, but hypothetically, let's assume we don't pay interest. Okay, so then can the government balance its expenditure using its revenue? Okay, so if we look at the 2021 numbers, and if we exclude the interest payments, still it is 242 minus 72, so that is 170%. So each $100 the government spends 100, each 100 rupee the government earns, government spends 170 rupees excluding interest payments. So for interest payment, the government may need another 100 or so. Okay. During 2016, 17, and 18, this was balanced. So that's what I mentioned, that the primary balance was close to zero or positive. Okay, but now 70% is still a question whether to cut defense, education, health, welfare, community. So I mean, something has to be reduced. However, so far to stabilize the economy, the solution everyone was looking for was to cut expenditure. But you can see in the current situation that is impossible. Okay, because there's a limitation to cutting expenditure. So there's no, in the current situation, under the current circumstances, there's no other option than raising the revenue. So what needs to be done is increasing the revenue. The expenditure has to be curtailed, but it is more important to increase revenue. So that means taxing people. Okay, so that is the current situation. So the main challenge is balancing the government budget, and the answer to this is political. So I think I should questions, so I can elaborate on these things further. So if you want to know a long-term solution and long-term what I need to do, I can explain what Singapore did, but since I have already used the time, so probably I should have used. I will questions. So the moderator wants to propose anything? There are some questions here. Okay, I can answer some of these questions if you want. Question is, yes, wait. So how to see? Yes, I can see one raised hand. So any question to be asked? Okay, meantime, I will go through your questions and answers. So one question is some scholars. So I know, I mean, this is Steve Hanke proposed to set up a currency board as before 1950 in the place of CB. What is your opinion on this? Okay. One way, this is a political decision. So setting up a currency board means you give up your independence, your monetary independence. Okay, your monetary policy is determined by foreigners. So more than whether a currency board should be set up. Now the question is whether it is possible to say set up a currency board right now. Currency board means assets we have, foreign assets we have. That's a very nice idea. So if necessary, I can explain the status in Singapore. That's a system in Singapore. But now the problem is, as I have explained very clearly at the beginning, we do not have assets. On net basis, we have a huge, say, pile up of liabilities. So to set up a currency board, we need to have a reasonable, sufficient amount of foreign reserves. So in this situation, whether we want or not, it is impossible to establish a currency board. I mean, it is very hard. Maybe Professor Hanke is an expert on this. Maybe he have suggestions how to do this. But the first thing is, this is not easy. And the number two is, what do we try to achieve by setting up a currency board? Simply, that means the government does not have any ability to print money. That means government has to balance its budget. It needs to balance its revenue and expenditure. If the government can do that, even the existing central banking system is fine. We don't need the currency board. Okay, if the government can balance the budget. So the fundamental problem is, say, how the government can balance the budget. As per the income and expenses graph, was it worse than last year due to COVID or accumulated debt? Income and expenses graph. I'm not sure which exact graph. Okay, I think government's revenue or accumulated debt. If you refer to the government's income and expenditure, it was mainly due to the government's decision to change the tax structure. That's what I think. I don't think it is due to. COVID had some impact. Again, that is not COVID itself. The government's some of the policy action, like restricting imports, etc. It's mostly say reducing the tax base. So that was the reason. That was the reason, rather than accumulated debt, because there was no specific contribution of accumulated debt. Accumulated debt had a contribution, but that was there at least for 7-8 years. Because sudden jump in 2021 and previously situation seems consistent. Okay. That sudden decrease was the result of the change in tax policy. It was not accidental.
So,
Yes,
Professor Vidura, thank you
Yes.
very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm sorry I had a small technical issue here, so I partially resolved it.
okay.
Now I will be handling most of the question that we have been receiving, and a couple of questions that I personally have. Now you have almost come up with I think 14 or 15 points altogether, which are certain points here lasted for very long time, and
Right.
the other points kind of very recent issues. Now
Right.
if I am to scale them, let's say from 1 to 10 as per your convenience, which
Right.
has contributed drastically. In one location I heard that you use the word suicidal when you are talking about this what you call tax rate cut down. That's where
Right.
I heard the word suicidal. Which
Yeah.
is the worst contributor to the whole case if you are out of this all the 14 or 15 points?
It is not possible to say rank which one contributed mostly, because it is a marginal contribution. What it means is, so when you are at the edge, even a small push would make a big difference. So the problems accumulated. So for example, so if we look at the problems with the external sector, as I have clearly shown, so since 1965 or so, we have been maintaining reserves around 20% of our liabilities, and we were playing with that. That was a very pretty low level compared to so most of the other countries. So at any point, we were vulnerable to a say external shock, and however, we could manage with this equilibrium, but with the support of IMF. So one mistake the country did recently was not going to the IMF. Okay, so at the first place, I mean, the problem should have been fixed so that there was no need to go to IMF. That's the ideal thing. But given we were in that situation, and no one wanted to rectify the situation with a long-term perspective, if we decide to live with that, then the option was to go to the IMF whenever there was a problem. Then when it comes to tax cuts, so that is something in the fiscal sector. So our fiscal sector, the balance in the fiscal sector was facing a big trouble, and the situation was deteriorating. So we wanted some measures to raise government's revenue, and that is exactly what we wanted. We purposely somehow took a measure which will decrease the revenue drastically. So that is kind of suicidal. I mean, it may not have been if we had a huge pile of accumulated reserves, but under the circumstances, that was suicidal. So I don't want to rank, but that was a big factor marginally.
Right, Professor. And next thing pertaining to the getting assistance from IMF. In
Right.
one of your slide, you plotted at what year we went to IMF. Because I think numerous times we have gone and we have requested their assistance whenever we had this problem.
Right.
But the irony behind
Right.
this whole picture is we have never learned the lesson out of this. You know, it has been a cyclic process apparently, as I understood.
Okay.
Why we didn't learn the lesson?
Okay. So we have so the answer lies in why IMF, what is IMF is for, and what do we expect by going to the IMF, and what do they expect to do when a country, member country, seeks some IMF assistance. So I had this slide, I think. Okay. So
Yes,
so okay. So in
I
this
think
slide,
this is yes.
okay. So all these red bars represent the years we were seeking the help of IMF. Okay. So now we need to understand what help we can expect from IMF. So the fundamental problem is we have a lot more liabilities than assets. We have accepted that as a fact. I think even now most of the political parties accept that as a fact. I haven't seen a strong dialogue to change this situation, at least in the long run. We can rectify this in the short run, but if we have a plan, we can change the situation at least say in 2040 or 2050. Okay, so we were trying to manage with 20% of this. So if that, we have to go to the IMF. So it is like using your credit card. Okay, you manage your, say, finances, but you use your credit card. So so under this equilibrium, going to the IMF repeatedly is a normal thing. It's not a bad thing, because IMF does not help you to move out of that. What they do is they will help you to solve your short-term liquidity issue. And each time when we went to IMF, we have managed to get it fixed. This time we did not go. We have a problem. So if we want to do something which will eliminate the need to go to IMF, we should have a long-term plan. So if necessary, I mean, it will take another 15 or 20 minutes. I can briefly explain what Singapore does. So it is exactly the opposite of what Sri Lanka does. But if not, this is pretty normal. Even if we go to the IMF and fix the problem now, so we will have a similar problem, say, maybe after some years.
Because I think here, even, you know, when you have an issue, it is totally okay to use your credit card and settle this, all your issues, and then, you know, move forward. But, you know, we are talking about the root cause also here. Now, but my question was like, you know, it's getting assistance and resolving the problem totally okay. But this, whatever the deficit appeared, repeatedly, and think we have failed to address this cause. Using your credit card when you are in a problem is an okay, but this problem has appeared throughout the history. That's the point I wanted to highlight there.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, so if you want, I can very fast, I will go through these slides to explain the difference. Okay, difference between Sri Lanka and Singapore, because Singapore is a kind of some sort of ideal country of many Sri Lankans. Sri Lankans like Sri Lanka to be a country like Singapore. So what is the story of Singapore? Okay, so this is the trade balance in Singapore. It continues, it is positive and it increases continuously, but in Sri Lanka, it is negative. And compared to Sri Lanka, the numbers are very large. Okay, and this is how the foreign reserve in Singapore accumulates. It accumulates each year. It gets accumulated. Okay, and the Monetary Authority, GIC, and teams Temasek. So they all three say there are three places where reserves of Singapore are maintained. So at end February 22, Singapore had 426 billion as its reserves. So Singapore is an economy with a GDP around 350 billion. So this is more than that. But not only that, it also had 744 billion at GIC. That is another. This is government saving. This is central bank saving, and there was another wealth fund which had 405 billion. So altogether, it is like say 4 times its GDP. Okay, so it has positive balance of payment and say as a percentage of GDP also. This is the important thing. The situation in Singapore was not very different from the current situation of Sri Lanka, okay, in 1960s, when the country was 1960 to 1980, when the country was established. Okay, so if you look at these numbers, you can see these blue lines are imports, the orange lines are exports. So Singapore did have a continuous trade deficit. Singapore did not fear that. Singapore did not try to restrict imports because these are connected. So if we want to export more, we need to import more. These are connected. Okay, so the Singapore, while Sri Lanka embraced statist and say nationalist policies, Singapore embraced more open policies. So it say was not fear to import. If so, what was the difference? The difference was here, expenditure to revenue ratio. Each year until now, Singapore government spends less than what it collects as revenue, say on its expenditure, and the remaining balance is saved. That goes to their reserves, and reserves are too much, more than enough to maintain its currency, because reserves serve 2 purposes. One thing is to stabilize the value of the currency. Singapore has more reserves than necessary to have a strong Singapore dollar. The remaining part is invested separately on a long-term basis, not to manage liquidity, on a long-term basis, and that is GIC. That is a government-owned fund. So most of the investments are done using that fund. Okay, so that's the difference. So in 2020 and 2021, because of COVID, say Singapore government also had to increase its expenditure because for various welfare measures, etc. So the income dropped, and the expenditure increased, and the primary balance was negative. But it did not have to even to get the savings, use the savings, but the return on savings alone was sufficient to cover that gap. So that's where you should try to reach in the long run. That is the long-term problem. That is the structural problem. And the Singapore dollar, we know, appreciated continuously. So it was fixed at $305 until 1970s. Then it started to appreciate gradually. So if the rupee appreciates, that is good. I mean, that's a fundamental say thing. So most Sri Lankans wants a strong Sri Lankan rupee. If the country has a strong currency, that is good. But that cannot be done artificially. If you try to achieve the target artificially, then the end is a disaster, as has happened now. So how did they achieve that? They maintained very low inflation. The inflation was very low. Inflation was very low because the country did not print money. So this is the fundamental mistake Sri Lanka did. If we go back, the government spends more than its revenue, and then the gap comes through say printed money. So that's what needs to be stopped, and for that the starting point should be here. Yeah. So how that should be done is political, but as a fact, what I can say is somehow the expenses has to be curtailed and income has to be raised. I mean, I have suggestions also, but this is the simple answer I can give. Yes, I will pass.
Right. Professor, now,
Yes.
While you are explaining this, especially when it's come to this revenue increase, which you mentioned in Singapore,
Right.
I don't think it's an overnight thing.
Yes. It's not an overnight thing, but there. I mean, okay. So can you hear me? I see some echo for some reason.
Yes, I think I fixed it.
You fix it? Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
It's not an overnight thing, but there are certain things. I mean, I can propose. I mean, these are some reforms, but I mean, any ordinary citizen will not find it say hard to agree with me, whatever your political affiliation, because in one sense, these are, I mean, in terms of party politics, this is not politics. So this is what I propose, and this is not something very strange. This is something done at many other countries, and probably most other countries. So it is some sort of say reducing the power of the central government and decentralizing the operations of the central government. But I do not mean that in a say usual sense. When we talk about decentralization, people always say think about the devolution of power to say, okay, so it is a kind of a devolution of power, but financial power. What I mean is now in Sri Lanka, this is very strange. All revenue comes to one big pool. And when everything comes to one big pool, the government has power to play with that as they wish. This is not how it happens in other countries. Okay, I'm not talking about the total size of the government. So, for example, take as an example, say, take University of Peradeniya. Now, University of Peradeniya becomes a financially kind of independent entity. When I mean financially independent, I don't necessarily mean that the University of Peradeniya should say earn its income. Okay, if it happens, that is ideal. But the income, the revenue of the University of Peradeniya can be tied to some income source, some taxes. So then, say the revenue, say, is kind of automatic. Say, for example, so everyone is charged. Say everyone needs to pay, say, for example, higher education tax as an example. Okay, higher education tax as an example, and that money goes to, say, all the universities allocated according to some formula. So then within a given year, the administration has the decentralized authority to manage those funds, not the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance does a passive role, collects the revenue and passes the allocation. That allocation is determined by an act. Okay, that comes to University of Peradeniya. Now the university say needs to spend only within that budget. So they have some income. I mean, even now that is how it is happening. But there's a difference. Okay, even now they have some allocation, but that is determined by Minister of Finance. If whenever they want, they can cut expenditure. Okay, so now out of that money, they need to save some portion. I mean, this is exactly how the universities in USA are functioning. Okay, they need to save part of that. Let's say 10%. And so they need to save, let's say 10% in a fund that is not used during each year. Okay, that is invested, and then the university receives an investment income. Other expenses are managed by remaining 90%. When there's a bad year like COVID or whatever, things go wrong, then it can draw down from its reserves. Now, if the income is not sufficient, they need to go back to people, or I mean, they need to make a campaign. Okay, this is not enough. We need more money, so they need to find out, say, more money. People should agree. Okay, for example, in USA, Now we need to pay a tax when we purchase gas, in the sense petrol. We call gas in USA, so that is petrol. Okay, when we purchase, we need to pay a tax. That tax doesn't go to a common pool. It is stated how that tax money is spent. Most of that goes for road development, because who pay for gas, who pay gas taxes are the people who use roads. So the cost of road construction should come from those funds. Okay, and each year road construction is done using that money in that fund, and also a part of that goes to airport development, because so fuel for airport industry also say includes a tax. Similarly, if most of the taxes are linked to different items like education, health, or whatever, then when you pay taxes, you know where it goes. Okay, where it goes. Then there's more transparency. Then people are more, less reluctant to turn to pay taxes. But now what happens when you pay taxes? You have no idea where that money goes. So this is an immediate reform to be done. So once this is done, most of the sources of revenue are tied to expenditure items. So then it will automatically balance. Then no one can misuse funds, because only a limited amount of funds are available for like administration and other expenses. So this is my one of the main changes, kind of political changes I expect should happen.
Do you think government is in a sort of an course of action to implement these things right now, or do you see
what I just suggested?
Yes, the few steps that you suggested.
I don't think this has even been discussed within political parties or anyone. This is my personal view, but this is not something very strange. This is how it happens in many countries, particularly in US.
Yes. So then what we can simply say is we are still not in the correct route for the recovery, I think.
I can't make bold statements like that, because whether something is correct or incorrect depends on the perception. So what government does is, a reflection of what people say wants. So government represents people. So so whatever. I don't blame any individual or say people, because government is the people say elected by people, and they are representatives. So directly or indirectly, government does what people demands.
So then we are also responsible. If people are representing the government, it's end of the day, it comes to us. Yeah. We can't simply we can't get ourselves isolated from the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Professor, when you explain in this whole picture, you took this 2010 as a very significant year, in which even I understood that when you were showing this all the graph, the dollar inflow to the country was very high, and because of that very reason, even the exchange rate was also very low. People started importing on one hand, and on the other hand, there was a huge amount of dollar within the country. My question is, now I think that affected numerous ways, because people started importing and people thought of having a lot of luxuries within the country. I think this mentality prevails since then. You clearly showed another wonderful point there. Now my question is, what happened to this dollar? Now this huge amount of dollar which came during this period, it simply came to our country and left out of the country just to make the import. So how this amount of dollar disappeared? Because when you're explaining about the USA, I noted that in USA, even your liabilities are generating money. I think that's your assets, and I think that's how I understood that. Your liabilities are generating money, so that's why US is having a very strong account. That's how you started the whole presentation. How this, even though US is having a negative scenario, still they are like,
No.
But sorry, what is happening there?
No. One correction. one correction. Liabilities do not generate money. Let me explain that. I have the slide here. Okay. Liabilities is a cost. So this is my point. Let me go there.
Early few slides, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So it should be here.
Can you explain US?
So okay. So the US liabilities are like 46 trillion. Okay. They do not
Yes.
generate money. US needs to pay 776 billion for these liabilities. Okay. But US has assets much less than liabilities, 70%. Okay. Those assets generate income. My point is, what US generates from these assets is higher than what it pays on its liabilities.
Yes.
Even though liabilities are higher.
Yeah.
Okay. Indirectly, I can say these liabilities also generate returns. I mean, that is what you mentioned. That is how it happens. So
what happened in 2010, sir? If you map this whole scenario there? Because we had a lot of.
In 2010, what happened was, if I use a technical word, Sri Lankan government externalized its foreign debt. Okay, so until that point, the foreign debt was in government's balance sheet. Now it moved the liability out from its balance sheet to the balance sheets of let's say others. Let's say, for example, banking sector. Okay, but the liability was there. But when someone looks at the government's balance sheet, it looks like, okay, government has not borrowed that much from other countries. And more recently, during the last year, what happened was they externalized its debt to the central bank. Now the central bank is in big trouble because all these swap arrangements, currency swaps means, say the central bank borrows on behalf of the government. That's technically what happens. Okay, so the government's debt does not increase, but now the central bank is in trouble. So simply what happened was the debt burden of the government was externalized. And if I relate this to what you asked, the biggest problem was that this increased imports significantly because people complain that the country imports more, and importing more is not a bad thing. Okay, you should not try to restrict imports. If you look at the numbers in Singapore, they did not try to import, restrict imports. The problem was imports were made artificially cheaper. That's the problem. I mean, you should let anyone, whoever wants to import anything, to import, but you should let the person pay its cost. If someone is still willing to pay the price, that's okay. Let him import. The problem here was imports were made artificially lower by maintaining the value of a dollar much lower than it should be. So when that happens, okay, I will take one example. I mentioned this earlier also. The true price of a gas cylinder, true cost of a gas cylinder is 5,000 rupees. Now you get it at 1,500. Okay, each time when you buy a gas cylinder, say that 3,500, that gap adds to the country's debt stock, because indirectly that adds to country's debt. But it is not just 3,500. Okay, so if the price is 5,000, only one person will purchase a gas cylinder. When the price drops to 1,500, not one person, 3 people buy gas cylinders. Now 3 gas cylinders. So the net loss is now 10,500. You can see what happens. So this has a kind of a spiraling effect. So each time when you say try to maintain the exchange rate low, imports become cheaper, and people import more, and to maintain the exchange rate at that level, you borrow more, and using the borrowings, then you maintain the exchange rate low. Okay, the low exchange rate and stable exchange rate itself attracts now foreign capital, which is used to maintain the exchange rate. So this cycle continues until say it collapses at some point, because people know that the rupee is not as strong. I mean, foreigners, whoever brings dollars to the country, knows that the rupee is not as strong as the country shows, but still it will collapse at any point. But still it is worth investing in Sri Lanka until that happens. We could see that even during the immediate, say, last year, for example, the sovereign bond was paid in January, 500 million was paid in January. So a few months or weeks ago, say in the secondary markets, that bond could be purchased at a, say, very high yield, like maybe 50% or 60% or even 70%. I don't remember the number. Okay, so there was a high risk that the money would not be paid back, but people invested in that because of the high return. Even Sri Lanka did that some years ago. I mean, Sri Lanka invested in those Greek bonds when it was very clear that they are likely to default, but invested. So people do that. So after 2010, we attracted that type of speculative, say, dollars. We attracted speculative dollars. And even very recently, we tried to go back to that system and we tried to attract speculative dollars. But now, at this time, the things were so severe and the country could not attract speculative dollars, because they take risks, but to a certain level.
And now, when it was evident that the only way of recovering the situation was IMF, as per your understanding, why the government refused to go to the IMF at that time? What could be the reason, as you understand? I don't think, because the central bank itself has expert. I don't think the governor will have, total authority to do whatever he wants. So it also has expert.
Right.
This is the mystery actually. Even now the president has accepted that we could have gone early, and even you are claiming that we could have gone early, but it did not happen. We had all the experts there, Sri Lankan beings, very proactive in most of the cases. I don't know, but this did not happen. Why, sir? What could be the reason, as per you understand? This is a huge mystery even for the country, I think.
I think that was a problem of the political ideology, because some of the politicians were strictly against going to the IMF. Their policy, say, itself, that the policy they were advocating was a strategy to remove the IMF plug. They used the same words. So this was there was a powerful political voice against going to the IMF, and also there was a strong say support for say local knowledge. I mean, we looked at this at say other places also, like when responding to COVID, for example. In Sri Lanka, there was a strong ideological support for local solutions. I mean, I'm not criticizing. This is my observation. So, not going to the IMF also was a part of that ideology. So it is. In one way, that was the choice of people. I don't think most people, including the people say who were supporting going to the IMF at that time. Some people who were supporting going to the IMF did understand the consequences, because most people were against going to the IMF without knowing the consequences. And some people who suggested going to the IMF also did that. I mean, not the main people who understood that, economists or other people. Some people even supported that move because they were affiliated with a political party who were in support of going to the IMF. I don't think most Sri Lankans, ordinary people, had an understanding about the gravity of the problem and the consequences by delaying going to the IMF. And even personally, from my point of view, okay. The situation in Sri Lanka was much serious than I could observe as an outsider, because I see the true picture when the numbers are released by the central bank or Ministry of Finance. I know the reserve position maybe after a month or two, but people within the government and the central bank know the true status kind of on a day-to-day basis. So
I think even the Lebanon was facing similar situation, and we could have taken some example out of those, but still we didn't do anything there.
Yeah. So there are examples, but I mean, yeah. So I mean, since we know a lot more about Sri Lanka, and I mean, at least personally myself, we have the numbers and we have all the details. I mean, we even don't need to say look at other countries. We can. It is very easy to see and visualize, imagine what would happen, say under different policy options.
It's a very serious decision. It's a very serious decision because few people declined at that time due to their political priorities, and now the whole country is suffering right now, and
Okay.
everybody is accepting that. So that's the issue. I mean, personally,
I can answer that question in a slightly different way also. So let's go back to our balance of payments. Okay, balance of payments. So obviously, even though it was not the say complete story, COVID did have an effect. Okay, so COVID did have an effect on the balance of payments. So let's look at these numbers. Okay, so tourism was a big factor. I think the policymakers connected to the government were expecting, not incorrectly, okay, they were not fully wrong. They expected the tourism sector to recover kind of soon. Most of the measures to control COVID also were attempted at, say, making the country COVID-free and have more tourists within the country. So suppose the country could attract tourists as before COVID, and they took various measures like vaccinating everyone finally and take strict COVID containment measures, etc. So suppose if this number increased to 3.5 billion, there are 2 billion more. I mean, there was some room to manage the cash flow, some room. What they did not expect was the drop in the emergence of these Hawala and Untitled systems and the drop in say remittances. That was the say biggest thing. That was something they did not expect. Even I personally could not predict that the effect would be so severe. So if we look at the numbers, should be here. The numbers should be here somewhere. Okay, tourist remittances. The remittances were so consistently around 7 billion for many years, since 2012 or 13. For many years, consistently, the country earned over 7 billion in remittances. So this was considered as a given thing, because even during COVID, remittances increased. It did not decrease. I don't think anyone at the central bank or at the government expected remittances to drop drastically. Remittances dropped from 675 million a month to 200 million million a year. 200 million a month means 2.4 billion a year. And if this trend continued, it could have been even lower. So this was unexpected. So here there's a gap of close to 5 billion. If this did not happen, they may have managed with these bilateral loans sometimes.
And there's another question appeared in the chat box. I don't know how much time we are left with, but this is related to one of your previous answers. So I feel like elaborating that again here. And he has agreed one of your answer, but he said that the fully liberalized market economy is the ideal solution. So he agreed that.
Right.
But in a country like ours, in this crisis, how can the government support marginalized people without impacting the economy?
Okay, yeah, that's an important question. So as you know, practically, I mean, in any country, say the kind of low-income people are supported in some way. I'm not I'm not in fundamental disagreement with this. I mean, people should be supported. Reducing income inequality also should be a goal. Okay, so but it doesn't necessarily conflict with say liberalized market economic policies. The point is, the current structure actually does not help the marginalized people. I mean, it looks like they are, but it doesn't happen. So the what is paid to them is kind of collected back as indirect taxes. So they are really not benefited. So so the people who should be supported have to be clearly identified, and they should be supported. But you can't say the government cannot create resources. That's a fact. If the government needs to give something to some group of people, it has to be collected from another person. Now the problem is, say the government has $100 to spend $242. Government collects $100 and spends $240. So while that problem is there, I mean, that is the main problem. Everything else has to be solved, say, within the availability of resources. The answer is political. You have to support them, but if you need to support them, you need to reduce some other expenses,
Professor Tennakon, now I have another question. I think you have partially answered this question, but I would like to repeat a few more things that have been mentioned there. Please, okay, he has asked, please ask short-term and mid-term strategies we want to implement now. And that's the question here. I think you have partially answered that. And I would like to also add one point there. What should we do as a citizen? I think individually, economy is collection of every citizen. Like we are talking about this billion and millions and every bigger thing there, while we are, addressing them. What should we do as an individual? What is your advice for me as a human citizen?
Okay. So in general, I mean, in this situation, or in any other situation, as an individual's main motive should be to earn much as you can, simply. I mean, and when you earn more, you can, I mean, it's like the government. I mean, if you take an individual, you should earn as much as you can, and whatever your earnings can be spent as you wish. I mean, whether it is your consumption or your investment, or if you want to help the society and others, that's okay. That's your personal choice. But simply, you should not expect, say, your consumption to be supported by anyone else. That's a fact. I mean, if you want to borrow, that's again your personal choice. But as a fact, if you borrow and use that funds on liabilities, you will be in trouble in the long run. If you borrow and say use that funds, invest that funds on some asset, you will have a bright future. When everyone as individuals think about earning something, say rather than like earning something and saving something, that aggregate effect is the entire country will have savings, will have more earnings and more savings. So the GDP of the country is the aggregate sum of the individual earnings. So whatever you earn by proper means contributes to the GDP. So if we come to this current context, so there's a dollar crisis. So the best thing, both individually and for the country, is this is something everyone can do. But at least, I mean, many Sri Lankans can do. Probably at this point, one of the best approach is to think about ways to earn foreign revenue, foreign dollars, foreign earnings somehow. I mean, providing a service or like, I think providing services, whatever the services, will be more practical than providing, say, producing goods and exporting. That is not bad, but whatever the way, if you can provide services, that is a quick and faster way of earning dollars, which will help you and ultimately the country.
Right, sir. And in general, I have heard this, every crisis creates some sort of opportunity.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
What are the opportunities behind this? As a nation, what are the opportunities that we can highlight? Oh, it doesn't valid here.
No, I mean, there are opportunities. So, I mean, what is the difference happened immediately after the crisis? The immediately thing was what happened immediately was the increase in the value of a dollar. So, in other words, rupee became much cheaper. So, you need to explore, say, what changes did it make? Say, this is not good news for those who were, say, making money using any imports or imported materials. But if it was other way around, it is good news. It is good news. So I think when the price of a dollar increases, it will come to an equilibrium naturally. So you ask the short-term, say, solutions. So for example, the price of a cylinder of gas or the price of a gallon of petrol is increasing. The problem of most people who are attending this session, I mean, I know the people here are not very low income people. They are professionals mostly, or somewhat middle income people. So their problem was shortage of these items, the queues, more than the price. Price was a problem, but the main problem was the shortage. I know some people like maybe like lawyers who have expensive cars and who has money. They have rupees. I mean, the truth is, maybe there are say low-income people in the country who are struggling to live, but many of you who are here have rupee incomes. You have rupee money. The problem middle class faces is you do have money, but you don't have the things you usually purchase using that money. So you don't have the same life. Okay, same life. So that's so with the policy actions, what will happen is most of the things will become unaffordable to many Sri Lankans. Most of the imported items will be unaffordable. So after that, very soon, these queues will disappear because people are not in a position to say pump petrol to their vehicles or their three-wheelers or buy gasoline. So then the demand drops. When the demand drops, queues will disappear. At the same time, the import bill also will reduce. So then it will come to a balance. That is the only way it can balance. Any other measure to say give these imported items at a cheaper price will only worsen the problem. It will spiral up the thing. It will not solve the problem in the long run. But once it settles, people still have the desire. People are going to think, okay, so like 2 years ago, I used to say cook using gas, but now it is unaffordable. My income is not enough. Then, I mean, people always are, say, motivated to, say, increase their living standards. They think ways to earn money. This drive will always be there. So people will work towards that goal naturally. And ultimately, they will somehow find a way to earn money, earn some real income and afford these things. It will happen. The economy will bounce back to where it was. So there is an anomaly created by, say, artificially suppressing the exchange rate. It has already corrected now, I think. It has already corrected. But the problem is the consequences of maintaining the exchange rate artificially low for at least 15 years will be there for several more years, because the exports were discouraged and imports were promoted gradually over a period. Okay, so you can't change the things overnight. Now the price has adjusted, but people need time to adjust to the situation. People will adjust.
We have one engineer from the audience, that is Engineer Arunananda.
Right.
He has raised his hand. Engineer Arunananda, over to you.
Yeah, actually, I remember in 2016, Greece has the some economic crisis. I don't know whether the situation is similar to Sri Lanka, and I would like to know what is the current situation there, and over the last 5-6 years, and they regain their economy back, and what approaches they have taken. Could you hear?
I can hear. If I want to, I mean, I don't want to because this is a very broad question. Because I don't say like to give a voice cut type of answer, because if I want to explain this, I need to explain the status of the, I mean, macroeconomic fundamentals of Greece and the problem and everything. Otherwise, if I give a short answer, it will be misleading. I don't like to give say a short answer like this. Problem of using some other countries' debt, so I need to, I mean, explain the context.
Right, and we have Yasela Sumanasinghe. Yasela, over to you.
Thank you, Jagat, and thank you very much, Professor, for your wonderful explanations and lecture. But my question is, now our central bank has increased its lending rates, right. So it has gone to 25% or 22, 23 margin, and with this inflation, I think there is a possibility to increase it more and to establish the balance what you have mentioned. I think that is inevitable, but still this will be an issue for a banking sector, and we need to protect our banking sector as well. So what are the pros and cons of this increased lending rates? That's what my question is.
Okay, so increasing the interest rate is the traditional, usual and most common tool used by central bank. Okay, and again, I need to say it clearly. A central bank in a country, whether it is in Sri Lanka or any other country, can do certain things. I mean, central bank cannot do say everything. So there's a limited scope of what a central bank can do. Central bank is in charge of the money supply. So in the current context, we have external sector problem. The price of the dollar keeps increasing. So keeps increasing means another thing I should clarify. So in news, I see that, okay, the price of the dollar has hit 300 rupees, and for the first time it has hit 350 rupees, etc. It makes news every day. I must make this very clear. The exchange rate is not floating yet. It has not been floated. When we say exchange rate has been floated, what we mean is the price of the dollar is determined by the supply and dollar in the free market. Still, we do not have a free market. Whoever wants to purchase dollars cannot purchase dollars. At some point, it will become stable and it will float, say, truly. But so far, what happens is central bank is, I think, guiding the dollar towards the floating rate. Okay, so that rate can be very high. So on the other hand, that means the value of the rupee has dropped. When the value of the rupee has dropped, central bank needs to take measures to strengthen the value of the rupee, because the central bank cannot influence the value of the dollar. That is determined by Federal Reserve Bank. That is an external thing. What the central bank can do is strengthen the value of the rupee. When the value of the rupee is strengthened, relative to that, the value of the dollar will drop, because exchange rate is a relative thing. When the interest rate is increased, what happens is the rupee becomes more valuable, because now if you have rupees, by saving your rupees at a bank, this is not related to inflation. No matter whatever the inflation, whether inflation is 2% or 100% or whatever, okay, compared to holding your currency, your rupee notes, if you save it at a bank, you will have a 20%, 25% return. But if you keep dollar bills, you have nothing. So when the interest rate increases, people think twice before converting their rupees to dollars. Okay, so this is a strategy behind increasing the interest rate. However, in the current situation, this strategy, as expected, doesn't work as expected, because the dollar depreciates faster, say, showing faster than the gain you can have by saving rupees at a bank. So 24% a year means 2% a month. The price of a dollar increases by more than 2% a month still. So this logic still doesn't work. So what is the solution? Should the central bank increase the interest rate continuously? Okay, so if the central bank needs to do that, the interest rate has to be very high, significantly very high, much higher than 24%. So for example, during the last month, I don't know the exact number, but maybe let's say the price of a dollar may have increased by let's say 20% or 30%. So that means per year it is like 360 or 400%. So to match with that rate, the interest rate has to be 300 or 400%. So the central bank doesn't do that because central banks view, and I agree, this increase in dollar rate, this rate of increase in dollar is temporary, because at some point it should stabilize. I think the central bank expect that to happen soon. I don't know exactly. That depends on how soon they will be able to get some funding from the IMF. So because of that, say increase in the interest rate continuously may not help. And you asked about the banking sector. That also is another issue. When the interest rate is increased continuously, it affects the profitability of the banking sector, because the bank's liabilities, bank's assets are long-term. Bank assets mean loans, loans are long-term. So usually someone gets a loan for like 5 years or 6 years, and on an agreed interest rate. So that means when the interest rates increase, banks do not increase their revenue very much, but their cost of funding, or their liability side, the cost of their liabilities increase, because when the interest rate increases, their deposits are short term. So people can withdraw their money anytime, and they can go to another bank if a bank does not rate the rate. So there is a risk that banks could collapse if the interest rate is increased very fast within a short time. I think the central bank, people at the central bank does very fine calculations, so they have all the data. So they look at all these things. I think they are careful to make sure that the banks do not collapse. So ultimately, say while the central bank tries to balance these two things, the monetary stability and the financial stability, so that requires, to achieve both these targets, that requires very strict, say, fiscal discipline. That is where I'm not sure, because the government needs to balance its budget. That will be very challenging. So I don't know how it will be done, because that is partly political.
And there's another question I would like to give the opportunity to Sirivardhana, Engineer Sirivardhana.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for this very informative presentation, Professor Dhanawat. My question, I have like two questions. So one thing that you mentioned related to the financial independent bodies, do you envision any structural reformations to take place in Sri Lanka to implement such independent financial bodies? Should it be constitutional reformations, or are there any other strategies that we could create in Sri Lanka to take place these kind of financial independent bodies? And my second question would be, Professor Dhanawat, is that in the revenues table that you have put, I think 28% of the budgetary allocations are for welfare payments. So what kind of welfare payments are we putting into these baskets?
So,
and
right. Okay.
And,
so
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I picked this number from the most recent annual report from the Minister of Finance. My understanding is this is mostly pension payments. Strictly speaking, this is not a welfare payment.
Okay. All right.
I think the majority is pension payments. Now there is another say important point. Okay, important point. What are these pension payments? Pension payments means so people have been hired by the government many years ago. Okay, so when you are working for the government, each month you need to, something is deducted from your salary, like what is called the pension, and what do you call some widow, and there's something like some term, some certain amount is deducted. Okay, that amount deducted is supposed to cover your pension expenses. In almost all countries I know, this amount deducted from your salaries, I mean, as I proposed, they goes to fund. They goes to fund, and pension payments are made from that fund. But in Sri Lanka, it doesn't happen. So something is deducted from your salary, and government spends that money. So the government doesn't have that money. So always pension payments are to be paid by the next generation. So the Sri Lanka strategy has been to pass everything to your next generation, because if the government needs to tax the current generation, there is political pressure. So if you want to borrow from abroad, then there are other conditions, etc. Easiest thing is to spend at the cost of your next generation, because they are not born yet, or they are too young. Okay? Actually, these pension payments, not just what the government should pay this year, but until the pensioner dies during the expected lifetime, should be part of the government's liability, should be part of government's debt, but they are not in debt statistics. In reality, they are commitments. So in the public debt of other governments, this part is directly or indirectly added to the government's debt stock. Here it is classified as welfare. It is not welfare. It is something you have worked for. It is something you have earned.
And I think I'm getting few messages to, because there are a lot of questions actually appearing, and even I am also very much interested in getting my doubts cleared.
Right.
And we have a lot of people waiting, and they are also very eagerly listening to you. Now I will come up with few more questions, Professor. Now, one thing, now country has been declared defaulted.
Right.
So this is a new scenario. Of course,
right.
We will not be paying whatever amount that we have to pay as a country. But for the citizen, I mean, for me as an individual, what could be the impact? Actually, one of my friends recently said that when they tried to apply for visa, it was rejected. And they said that could be the reason. And I think I'm seeing these kind of very dark pictures everywhere. But what else, Professor? You know, if countries declare default, I mean, this is the first time we are experiencing something like this in our whole life. Nothing had happened similar to this before. So as an individual, what could be the repercussion, Professor?
I don't think there will be an effect like that. So particularly like say since because the government has defaulted debt, you will not be issued visa or something like that. But it can have some consequences on some business operations and what you do as individuals, particularly when you are dealing with foreign countries. So for example, there is a possibility that the classification of some of the banks, for example, also will be changed as in default status, or maybe banks also will have to default as a consequence of what happens with the government. So then, so it becomes a problem when you try to do business, or even when you try to say transfer some payments or something involving foreign country, because the recipient does not have any guarantee that the so you can commit some payment to a foreigner, but your commitment is not credible, because not you are, as an individual, you are not known to the foreigner. So whatever the transaction it is. so since you do not have that credibility as an individual, you go through the bank, because the bank has the credibility. So ultimately, the banks can have some effects on individuals. But other than that, say what I see is, I mean, there was defaulting. That doesn't mean that that is eliminated. I don't know how it will evolve over time, but the country needs to pay this debt, and the interest payments and other payments will keep accumulating. If they agree to accept something less, that's a different thing, but it keeps on accumulating. So that means the problems are not over. So for the next 5 or 10 years, you need to earn to cover your day-to-day expenses and also to pay back this debt. So that will have a huge burden on individuals.
Right, sir. One last question before winding up. Now, let's say as an engineer, or we had a lot of dreams, building up a house and, buying cars. Some of us have already reached this, all the target, and some are still struggling. So if you were here during this time, what could be your action plan? Would you still continue your life? Would you take your loan from the bank and continue with your house building? Would you go for your holidays? Would you have the same lifestyle here? Or what could be your daily lifestyle and action plan if you are here, Professor?
Okay. Honestly, this is personal, but
Yes,
honestly, from the beginning, my lifestyle has been very different than this typical lifestyle. I don't think I have ever borrowed from a bank. So I worked at the central bank. Central bank had a concessionary loan. So when the market interest rates was like maybe, I don't remember the number, but it was very high. Employees of the central banks were given say housing or whatever the loan, huge amount at a very low cost, like 2.5% or something. It was like free. Everyone takes that. I even did not take that loan. Since I did not have the burden of loans, I was free to take decisions. Whenever the circumstances changed, I was free. So, I mean, yeah. So
if I re-articulate the question, then is it okay to go ahead with loans and continue your lifestyle? You borrow money from bank and continue with your house construction. Continue
as
with
an
your
individual,
as an individual, what could be your advice? Or you want us to wait little more, maybe 1 year or 2 years until situation is stabilized, and then you take your loan? Or what is your advice in that case? Because since you know the economic climate of the country right now, if I am asking an advice from you, if I am to take a loan, or maybe what could be your advice?
Okay, so if I go back to economic theory, the decision to borrow, or particular decision to borrow, okay, whether it is worth borrowing or not depends on 3 factors. I mean, it is about time value of money. Time value of money has 3 components. One thing is the inflation. Okay, inflation. So because of inflation, always if I isolate other factors, always it is more profitable to borrow than save, because if you borrow at a reasonably low rate, okay, you technically, even though in nominal rupees you pay more, you pay less than what you borrowed. So always high inflation means it favors borrowing. And then the real interest rate. Real interest rate means how much you need to pay over and above inflation. Okay, if the inflation is expected, inflation is 30%. If you can borrow at 25%, say you are better off borrowing. But if the interest rate is higher than that, you are not. So that's the second thing. Third thing is your time value of money. That is a strictly personal thing that varies from one person to another. The first two factors are more common. That's common to everyone. That means how much do you enjoy your current consumption versus your future consumption. Okay, so if you can go to a restaurant and enjoy today, compared to going to the same restaurant and enjoy your life after 10 years, how do you compare the two things? Do you enjoy doing it 10 years later or today? And if they are different, what is the ratio? Okay, so for some people, that present value is too high. I mean, for whatever the reasons. For some people, present value is not very high. If your present value is too high, you end up borrowing more. It is not necessarily bad. That is something about you, because it's something about the individual choice. So it depends on
next generation will pay.
No, I'm talking about the individual decision, because you borrow, you need to pay. I mean, I'm taking housing loan or car loan or anything. Okay, so it is, I mean, technically it's next generation, but in this case, the next generation is yourself after 10 years, not another person. Okay, so you have an income stream and you are sure about that. It's okay to borrow.
Right, Professor. Thank you very much. Especially, I appreciate that you explain us the big picture in terms of millions and trillions and all, and give us the current situation. I think we could see a lot of people were attached to your presentation, as it has a lot of numbers, and we saw what had been happening throughout our history and most of the reason behind this current crisis that we are going through. And actually, the good thing behind that all, you told this whole thing which a very pleasant way. Because of that, actually, we also it was not frightening, and everybody was very comfortable, because if you describe it in a different manner, definitely rather than absorbing the scenario, people could be so scared and they were thinking what's going to happen tomorrow. But in this case, you were so careful in delivering this whole message in very smooth manner. I think everybody understood, and I believe that people will definitely be contributing, and they will be contributing, because we as engineers, as a citizen of this country, we should also be having our own opinion, and we should also contribute to the action plan that whoever responsible party would be implementing. And on the other hand, I really appreciate as the advices that you gave for the, in terms of individual citizen here. I think everybody would have had a very much understanding there, and the essence would have been taken. So thank you very much, Professor Tennakon. I had a wonderful time. I had a lot of technical difficulties due to this power outage, but somehow I got my opportunity. I wanted to talk with you, and thank you very much, sir. And we are looking forward to talking to you again and again whenever it is possible. And I'm wishing you all the best in your future endeavors. And in order to thank officially every individual who contributed for this particular session, I would like to invite our coordinator of this whole program, Engineer Lakmini, for the vote of thanks, to propose vote of thanks. Engineer Lakmini, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jagat. Thank you, Engineer Jagat. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As we conclude today's proceedings, it's time to show our appreciation to those who helped to make this event a success. So first and foremost, I would like to thank our resource person today, Professor Vidura Tennakon, for accepting our invitation and sparing us time of his busy schedule and enlightening us on the root causes of this current crisis of Sri Lanka we are facing right now with facts, and also the way forward to overcome this crisis as well. It was indeed an informative and interesting lecture, sir. And I'm sure you all in the audience have also enjoyed it as much as enjoyed by myself. Now I take this opportunity to present the virtual token of appreciation to Professor Vidura Tennakoon. Professor Vidura, please accept our virtual token. We are really grateful for your contribution to this webinar. Next.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your virtual token of appreciation. And also, if I did not go through all the messages, so if anyone has any follow-up questions, I mean, you can use my email, so I can try to answer. And thank you very much for this award and so my invitation and everything. Yeah.
Thank you again, sir. Next, I shall extend our gratitude to Engineer Sampath Godamune for being the bridge between Professor Vidura and the BSESC team. Further, I would like to thank all the committee members from BSESC committee who supported in organizing this event. Next, I would like to thank the technical staff of IESL. Without their support, this event would not be possible. Last but not least, our sincere gratitude to all of you for participating for today's event. One last thought before winding up. Let's all come together and do our part to bring this country back and this country out of its current ditch. With that note, I wish you all a pleasant evening. Good night. See you all again at the next webinar. Thank you.